In Japan, you can't really contractually do that. You have to give them at least a period of advance, and it's not like you're shut out of your systems the next day, like we hear so much on the news.
Hello and welcome back. Today we wanted to cover a few topics around the tech recession. First of all, what's happening globally? Second of all, is it happening in Japan? And third, what you should be doing and what you should be aware of as a marketer working in this market. We invited our guest, Melynie Yoneda from Reuters, to cover some things from the publisher angle, but then she also has an agency background, so she'll be discussing topics from that lens. And of course, as always, I'm your host, Bryan Rios, joined by
Joshua Grant. Hello.
So what is happening with the tech recession?
I think it's a bunch of things. I think the general consensus seems to be that during the pandemic, most tech companies made record profits because people needed to adjust their working behavior, their social behavior to being on lockdown and not being able to go out and do the things they normally do. As a result, you saw companies like Zoom and Facebook and Twitter and all of the big tech companies just sort of growing massively. And I think that there was this sort of misconception that life as we know it had changed, and that people wouldn't want to go back to bars and people wouldn't want to go back to restaurants, and that you'd want to spend your time in the metaverse and so on and so forth. And I think the new normal, right? Which, I mean, to be fair, like work, I think has forever changed. Like I think remote working and all of that will be here forever. But there were aspects of, I think, just general social behavior that I think a lot of these tech companies underestimated how important those were to people. And then what you saw is that and it was kind of interesting because you saw it kind of as a wave from like west to east, but like as the pandemic like restrictions started to curb market by market, America, then Europe, and now what's going on in Japan, what you realize is that people are like revenge traveling, like the airlines can't keep up with like the amount of people who are going on vacation, restaurants are booming, travel's back. And so these tech companies who thought that this was going to be a continuous trend hired tons of people to meet the demand. And then it turns out that actually it was all just this sort of period of time that was really this sort of crazy growth. And now they're having to like reckon with that. I mean, that's kind of the general idea. And then I think there's little things going on at each particular company. But just sort of generally, I think it was just an assumption that people would change forever and everybody started doing what they normally did before. I don't know if that's what like you would think as well, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's exactly what you said. We expected this, our tech companies kind of expected a new normal where we all stay at home and never go outside ever again. But it didn't happen. And I think that even now, when we have talks with our clients and probably yourself as well, like we see like an itch to get back in person. People want to be at events. People want real face-to-face experiences, and it's not enough to have just, a webinar or to be online with someone. There really is more of a value in being, I think, in person and present with people. And just because, we can't really compare how high tech companies grew during the pandemic to now, because it's kind of going back to not a new normal, but our old normal.
Right, exactly. Yeah. No,
Just
I mean,
normal.
yeah, I mean, most of the company, I mean, you saw this with kind of Netflix, right? And everyone was like, Netflix is over. And it was like, no, well, Netflix is just going back to the growth that they had, in 2019. And I think that, individually with these tech companies, let's look at like Meta, for example. So I think the thing here, I think they were probably the ones who, I would argue, probably made the biggest assumption about what the new normal would look like in terms of massive investments, billions of dollars into the metaverse, right? And from even just rebranding the company entirely. And Zuckerberg has gone on record and been like, I overestimated this. Like, I thought people would want to do these things. And I think what you saw is that I think people are creatures of habit and they want to be social and they want to do things. And I think that there was just not, the metaverse just wasn't as compelling as an alternative to just going and meeting your friends and doing stuff. And I think, what you see with Facebook is that you also, I mean, not to get sort of too into details, with Facebook, you have like a power thing, right? Because Mark Zuckerberg, for all intents and purposes, is like the king of Meta, right? In terms of like how the shareholders work, and he has kind of really ultimate authority. And I think that he, despite maybe other people saying, hey, we don't know if you should be investing heavily here, he saw this as his sort of, this was his path, this is what he was going to do, and he put a bunch of money into a product that A, isn't really very good, and B, just kind of assumed that, the average person would, buy a $500 Oculus and prefer to sit at home on the couch than to actually go out with friends or travel,
And drive 20
and
minutes to speak
drive.
to people.
Well, also,
Yeah.
I think that's the thing too. It's like there were people who, like, what people decided to spend their money on post COVID pandemic was very different than what I think people thought it would be, right? They, like, people wanted to go shopping again, and they wanted to travel again, and they went out to bars and restaurants. I don't think people were like, I'm gonna, you know, buy tech gadgets. Because even I think in one of the articles that we were talking about earlier, like, it's showing that even like tech gadgets themselves are like not selling the levels that they used to. So I just think it's back to kind of the regular normal.
Yeah, I think another factor there is that, as you mentioned, Meta, they like really went all in on the metaverse.
Yeah.
And then also, I think like Amazon invested a lot into like Alexa, which I do think is a okay product. I have an Alexa at home,
Yeah.
and it's a big source of frustration every night when we try to call my daughter's grandparents. But I do, and so I think that Alexa wasn't exactly, I mean, it wasn't making Amazon any money, and so I think a big portion of those layoffs came from the Alexa team.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think another factor was those big bets that companies were willing to place on tech that hasn't really proven itself to be solving any sort of consumer need yet. And it's kind of aspirational tech versus things that are actually solutions. And I do think that in a way, I don't want to say this is like necessary, especially for everyone who has been laid off, because I do think that it always is hurting especially when so many people's identities are tied to their jobs, which I think has been encouraged in this type of economic growth period. But it's kind of seeing this revert back to this downturn where maybe we're actually at the forefront of what is going to be the next sort of set of innovations, because I do feel like the last era of technology was really focused on developing the internet and browsers and eventually apps and smartphones. But a lot of the innovation has kind of happened at this point. I don't think there's a lot left to really be discovered there. There's no huge app that's going to change the world again. And so looking at those frontiers, I do think that like AI with Alexa or VR, AR, XR with the metaverse, is interesting, and I do think that it's nice that they were willing to maybe make those gambles, but they were gambles and they didn't pay off, and now we're seeing kind of the consequences of those gambles, and people are kind of paying with their lives, which is sort of unfortunate.
I mean, it's also like the point of entry. Like, I was having this discussion like a couple weeks ago with a friend. Like, if you take sort of AR and VR and then sort of the metaverse, I think it's about like accessibility and the point of entry. To participate in the metaverse fully is quite expensive. You need a VR headset. None of them are cheap.
Yeah.
You also need, as someone who has an Oculus, you also need space to move around and do all of the things that it's promising that you can do, like exercise and do all these things or dance or whatever it is that you want to do. And it's also very solitary. Like, of course, you have the ability to sort of have on your phone, for example, my friends can see what I'm seeing on their phone, but it's a very kind of solitary experience. At the end of the day, I don't think we cognitively forget that we're sitting alone in our house, right? As many people as we can talk to outside of. And I think that's the kind of underestimation. I will say also, I think, and like, it's just my personal opinion, I think if you are going to have someone be the face of the metaverse, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg was the right person to do it. I think he's often been called robotic himself, and I think that also whether he was genuine or not, I think the authenticity was questionable. I think if you're going to try to introduce this new way of living, I think you need someone who's got charisma and charm and can really be like, this is the next thing, right? And I just don't think he was the right person to do that. So I think that was part of the problem as well.
Just to talk about the metaverse for like one more second, I don't know if we need to spend that much time here, but this is not related to what we were going to talk about today. But I have kind of a question maybe for both of you, like as far as like activations in the metaverse. We touched on like Roblox recently with Phil, and like I feel like metaverse activations can kind of be conflated for just like any in-game activations. Like that's not necessarily something that's like overly new.
Yeah.
Is that like a different, what's the difference between maybe like an in-game sort of activation, like what people have done with Animal Crossing or like any other video game ever, versus like what's happening with like Nike and Roblox? Like,
I'll let Melynie answer
Okay.
that.
I mean, I honestly don't think it's really different from, as you mentioned, from any in-game activations. And especially, I think in Japan, when we were kind of looking at this fiscal, there were a lot of proposals and, clients wanted to see the metaverse. They wanted us to get it within our proposals when I was back on the agency side. And it's really difficult because I don't really see it different from having like an event, but because it is online, they think that, oh, this platform is here, it's free, you can do it for, like a couple $1,000s, right? Which is not the case, right? You need to, when it comes to the metaverse, if there isn't that space there, you need to build it from scratch, which is not much less than, it's not just a couple of hours of coding, right? You need to actually make something. And then figuring out how to actually activate it and get people in there. And I think that we kind of touched on, it's not a cheap thing. It's not something accessible to everyone. So just all of those logistics, it becomes very just complicated, I think.
and more costly. Yeah.
And I think also there's research done. I think McKinsey had a report that came out not too long ago. I mean, it skewed more toward luxury, but Japanese consumers prefer in-store shopping. If you look at sort of e-commerce across major economies, Japan has always come very low in that regard. Of course, there is obviously growth that happened during the pandemic, right? Because obviously that happened everywhere. But if you look at how sort of the store experience is bouncing back, I think that's one of the reasons. I think, for example, here in Japan specifically, the metaverse is seen more as a novelty and really an extension of gaming, in my opinion, than it is this sort of real life, practical, like I'm going to do my day-to-day living within this space. It just seems as like, oh, this is just an extension of like PlayStation or Xbox or whatever, as opposed to these real sort of tangible things. So yeah, I think if you take a sort of Japanese lens on it, it just seems that, consumers like to be in the store. They like to touch things, particularly things that are going to be expensive, that they're going to buy. I think NFTs are seen as something that's just like, oh, this is cool and it's fun and there are people that are into it. But if you're going to try to, as what Meta did, if you're going to try to double down on like, this is the future, I mean, you need regular people to like want to use that. And I'm like, I can't see, like my sister putting on a VR thing to like go grocery shopping. Like, it's just not going to happen. So not yet. I think the mistake is not that it won't happen. I think the mistake was the bet was 5 years as opposed to maybe 15, right? Or something like that. So
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good place to maybe talk a little bit more specifically about Japan and whether or not Japan is in a tech recession or facing the same challenges as the West. Any thoughts there? I don't know.
I mean, I think we can agree that Japan is a pretty unique market, and you can't really compare it apples to apples to like the US or Europe. In terms of the tech recession, I don't think, honestly, it has hit Japan as hard as it has the West. Obviously, we were talking earlier a little bit about layoffs, right? And in Japan, you can't really contractually do that. You have to give them at least a period of advance, and it's not like you're shut out of your systems the next day, like we hear so much on the news. And at the same time, I think that, Japan is just an interesting landscape. So if we talk about another big change, which would be Twitter, right? I think that Elon Musk, even though he did lay off over 50% of his workforce, he did mention in an interview a couple of days after that Japan each market should strive to be like Japan,
Yeah.
and that he is going to move a big portion of his engineers to Japan, and I think it was India.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're going to see as much of a recession here, particularly. But at the same time, I think it is because of the way that the market kind of works
Yeah.
and just laws, and those are the things that are going to kind of keep
Slow it down.
slow it down, and make it different from the West.
Well, also like inflation, along with what you said, like also inflation levels are just not where they are in other parts of the world, right? So you do see obviously inflation here, but if we're talking, I mean, I don't know, like I think it was like 3% or something like that where we're sitting around in Japan compared to like I think the UK is like wild, right? So I think that has an effect too. Is that from an employment standpoint, there's the laws and stuff that protect, but I think also you're just not seeing as much of things just going crazy as I think you do in other places. And I think that sort of contributes largely to why you don't see such an influx of. Now, some people say maybe similar to everything else that things hit Asia Pacific a bit late, and that come the start of next year, then everybody's going to be freaking out. And I don't know, we'll see. But for now, it just seems that there's just less of an impact here because of obviously legal protections, but also just inflation not being as excessive as it is in other places. And I also think, particularly for Japanese companies, they tend to be a bit more conservative in general when it comes to. I think I was reading something funny about like Japanese companies keep like 2 years worth of revenue like in cash in the bank or something like that because they're just afraid to get into a situation where there isn't money. So I think one of the reasons you don't see that is just also just how kind of traditional Japanese companies operate with being very cash positive, and sort of that helps kind of alleviate some of the stuff that you're seeing in like other markets. And then obviously Twitter is just like a whole different. Twitter is just a whole different thing. To his credit, though. Twitter, I think, is having like the most number of daily users than it's had in a really, really long time.
Because you can do whatever you want.
Well, also watching, I think there's also a bit of like watching Rome burn kind of thing that's going on. But I mean, Elon Musk is like tweeting like every 2 hours, it seems like. And it is this kind of like, it's just crazy what's going on there. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. To your point about new innovation, it'll be interesting to see what all of these people who leave Twitter decide to go do, I think, as well.
A non-advertising funded social platform.
Well, there's things that have already kind of emerged. There's one called Post, which I'm like on a waiting list for. Jack Dorsey from Twitter said that he's going to do one. There's some other stuff coming up. What's interesting about, to sort of put this into advertising perspective, I think that what's interesting is advertisers don't want free speech, right? Like, and what I mean in that is there is, I think what he underestimated was the amount of revenue that comes from advertising that drives Twitter, but also that this idea that brands would be like, yes, we are behind people saying whatever they want. And it's like, well, actually, no, we're not, right? We want some level of control parameters to be able to control our brand. And I think that's where he's sort of messing up, but we'll see. I mean, see what happens there.
Yeah, I think that brand safety is just like a top of mind issue for like a lot of brands. And I think that Twitter is not, even in the past, maybe hasn't been so synonymous with brand safety. And so I think even now, I mean, especially now, it's just...
Do you still use Twitter? For example?
I don't actually.
Did you ever before though?
Oh yeah, I was a pretty heavy Twitter user, but I actually stopped
use
previously.
Twitter?
No, I do not.
Okay. Did you before or just recently?
No, I use it for work, so to monitor, but I'm not an active tweeter, I would say.
Well, because I don't tweet, but I definitely read it, and it is interesting. I just think it's gonna be interesting to see what he does. What's funny is that Apple, who he's like having this battle with, is like one of Twitter's biggest advertisers, which he revealed, which I thought was quite funny. But yeah, I mean, this is the thing overall with tech. I just think that sometimes they think that they have a crystal ball. One other thing I was going to say, I was watching this interview on CNN, and they were talking about like Elon Musk specifically, and they were like, why do people like revere him? Like, why do people think that he's so great, right? Because as many successes as he's had a number of failures as well. And what this journalist was saying that I thought was really interesting is he goes, tech gurus, like if you look at, all of the, like what's going on with FTX, Elizabeth Holmes, like all of this stuff that sort of happened, why, like the WeWork guy, like why does this continually happen where we get behind these like, tech gods and then we kind of worship them? And he said something I thought was really brilliant. And he said, because for most people, tech is the closest thing that we get to magic. And so we have this idea that if these people can like do these things, really interesting things in our lives that we don't understand, but for some reason it's like so cool and it makes our lives so much easier. It's like magic and we kind of worship it. And so this is where I think that kind of emboldens tech companies to be like, well, we have a crystal ball. Like we know that everybody's going to want to be in the metaverse. We know that everybody's going to walk around with AR glasses on and stuff like Snapchat or whatever. And then you realize like, no, I mean, people are people and some of our behaviors just remain consistent. And you don't always have the crystal ball. So
yeah, Elon Musk is Elon Musk's best PR stunt. Like
he's really good at it, right? I mean, he keeps himself in the news.
He's like, yeah. I don't want to say too much. There's other people who are,
He'll come at you. Don't tweet him. He'll tweet you back, apparently. He'll tweet you back.
And I mean, as far as like Japan's tech recession, from our perspective, being a recruitment company here, we have, I feel like, a pretty good finger on the pulse as far as like jobs that are opening, people who are looking for jobs, layoffs. And for us, we've actually seen the impact really with most of the global companies. So like most of the people who are being affected by this recession are in like any kind of like global startup or tech solution that was in Japan and is now potentially leaving Japan or
and there's like hiring freezes,
yeah,
right?
A lot of hiring freezes across all platforms. And the companies that are actually still really building are a lot of the domestics, which has traditionally been a little bit slower, I think, on the hiring, aside from like on the engineering side, but like and so to kind of see these companies still being able to bring in new staff, like if there are people who are laid off or want to work in Japan, I think it's actually a really good opportunity to join one of these maybe Japanese companies and help them maybe grow globally, where I think that the dollar is really strong and bringing those into Japan can help. And so I think that we've kind of covered the global perspective. We've covered Japan specifically. We went into how this happened. I just wanted to get your opinion as a previous agency person, current agency person, and also working with publishers now, as a publisher now. How do you guys feel advertising was affected or plays into this recession? Overall, like what do you think the impact will be maybe on marketing as a whole?
Well, I think it still continues to change, and we're going to have to kind of look at it as we start to prepare for next fiscal here in Japan. But I think it kind of does go back to what we were talking about, real life, just in-person experiences. I think that for the past couple of years at Reuters, at least, we've had a lot of webinars. It's been a lot online, but we are starting to get a lot more requests for in-person things or to assist with I guess just the content creation for in-person events. So I think that a lot of our clients, especially just with kind of COVID getting a lot calmer and people wanting to be in person more, and also just the recession and people getting a lot more conservative with their marketing strategy, we're going to see a lot more kind of conversion-based things. They're going to want just more, I guess, physical results. One of my clients actually said that one of their KPI is actually the number of business cards they receive, which I thought was that was a pretty extreme. But it's not necessarily a time where people can just be throwing around money and looking for just page views or clicks, right? People want conversions and they want actual concrete results. So I think that's definitely going to be something we see in the next coming year.
That's super interesting. And especially like from our perspective, where a lot of our business is driven by in-person and just meeting people. And a lot of the younger people who I work with now, they're hesitant. Like it's there's more of a hurdle into getting into live events almost, or like really even being open to meeting people. And so yeah, I think it's so surreal to me because the market that I came up in obviously was before COVID, and when I was in the States, my whole career was based on live events. And so yeah, and so like moving here and then having this happen, and like kind of trying to get people to be enthusiastic and willing to meet with people has been like a challenge for us. And so I do think that there is that kind of bottled up tension that people are wanting to release and go meet people, but I do think that maybe like within work specifically,
Mhm.
people are like, oh, couldn't this just be like a video call, or couldn't this just
Well,
be
you
an
have to give
email?
people a reason to go out,
Hmm.
I think is what I don't think people feel as obligated to be as social as they used to be. And you see that a lot with like sort of work things. You know, you used to go out with your colleagues and go drinking a lot and do a bunch of fun stuff. And then some colleagues are like, no, if I never see my team ever again, I would be fine.
I
And
never know
so
how tall people are now.
no, and I think and so you'll see that I think with events that will take place is that everything is going to have to be leveled up to be compelling enough to get people out of their homes, and to get them to want to interact. And I think, you know, there was an article in The Economist like 3 years ago, and it was talking about like basically when would we get over like our post, like when would the PTSD of COVID end? And they said it would be around like 2024, and we'd go through this whole sort of hedonistic period that people still have to get very comfortable with going out. So I think the level of what the level of expectation for why I should go out is going to be really high. And then what I'll say to the point about marketing, I agree that there's definitely going to be more accountability in marketing efforts, and that there's going to be more results seen in terms of very like tangible tactical results. At the same time, I think that we can't forget like the importance of just pure branding, and how much of a role that plays. And like if you look at like a lot of companies, there were a lot of companies that just sort of cut advertising budgets or just did only performance branding. But if you take, for example, Airbnb, who prior to I guess they're a really good case study, but prior to the pandemic, they decided to cut all performance advertising. They were only going to do branding, and they were only going to focus on the brand of Airbnb and the Airbnb services and so on and so forth. And they've had incredible success with that. I think it's different, obviously, between selling services and selling a product. But I think what a lot of brands did very smartly, which we encourage brands to do, was you want to stay top of mind so that when people, because people saved a lot of people saved a lot of money during the pandemic, right? So when people are ready to go back out, make sure that they think of you as where they want to spend their money. I work a lot with luxury brands, and luxury has become like, I mean, better than pre-pandemic numbers, right? Because people had this money and they were like, as soon as I'm done, I'm gonna go buy this thing, and they did. So I do think obviously we have to pay more attention to sort of tangible tactical metrics like how much product are we pushing, how much business cards are we getting, and so on and so forth. But I think we can't forget at the same time that like brands aren't built just on performance, right? And that you still have to really um, remind people why they should spend their dollars with you, particularly when they're being so cost effective at the moment, which is like, yeah.
Yeah. As time goes on, I feel myself becoming more and more of like a brand marketing evangelist, I think,
Hmm.
where I think there are a few reasons. But I mean, I think what we do here at Wahl+Case is really focused on building that kind of like lifetime value in hopes that people will feel connected to us as people and as a brand,
Hmm.
so that they trust us enough to where if they're looking to change careers or build a team here, like we're again top of mind, like you were mentioning.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that you had said before in another conversation was that if you're marketing services, branding is almost everything.
Yeah.
Whereas like if you're marketing a product specifically, that's when performance and direct sales obviously is much more important. Um, and yeah, and the Airbnb thing is super interesting. It's not something I had been familiar with, But I also remember that I think like P&G had done that at one point. They cut a lot of the digital budget and saw like this big lift. And then there was another case study that I had heard of where this is more about attribution specifically, where like attribution, Last Touch Attribution had reported like 1,800, somewhere around there, sales. And then there's like another form of attribution that had reported like 1,700 sales. And then the like experiment, like where people were shown the ad versus not shown the ad. And the people who were showed the ad actually resulted in like 26 less sales than people who were not shown the ad. And so I do think that there's some flaws with digital overall.
Yeah,
And I do think that that performance, I think, gets favored a lot because it's very easy to track. I mean, that's like the beauty of it.
and there's pressure. I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
like it's the same thing that we're, to circle this back to tech companies. It's like the same thing where we've gotten into this like cycle where it's year over year growth, right? Like I had a friend say to me like, why are they saying Netflix? Like Netflix has tons of subscribers and makes tons of money. Why were people like, this is the end of Netflix? Because they didn't have one semester of growth.
Yeah.
They're still a huge company, right? All of these tech companies are still huge companies. And I think that like when you talk to our clients, right, like they're, particularly if it's product, what they look at is like, did we sell more product than we sold last quarter? Nope. Okay, you're done, right? And so obviously if you're the brand manager, you're like, okay. And so you trickle that down to then your team, who then trickles that down to the agency, who's then like, okay, everything we do has to result in a direct sale. And I think when you have product, it's much harder to combat that. But I think that's what we have to get back to, is kind of this idea that brand building is long term, right? And you don't see the results right away. You can have both performance and branding, but like keep in mind that you can eventually have such a good brand that I don't need to see a performance ad from you. I'm just going to go get what it is that I know that I want. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think working for a publisher now, we're obviously not going to be beating Google or any ad network based on like CPC or CPM or anything like that. But it is really, you have to look at it more long term, I believe.
Yeah.
And especially now, I think that there's a lot of problems around trust. And it started from, the whole Trump fake news back in the day. But even now with Elon Musk taking over Twitter and the whole free speech thing, it's people really want, and advertisers, they want a platform where it's trusted and, we can have proper parameters and you can make sure that your ad is not along something that is not factually correct.
Yeah.
And so I think that, well, I'm hoping that at least moving into the next years to come, that there will be more of an understanding that, working directly with publishers and maybe not necessarily just chasing a certain number of clicks or chasing a certain CPC, and that kind of marketing will come back into play.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, like, so one of the things you said I thought was really interesting, which is this idea of like basically positioning certain publishers as more premium, not just based on like the premiumness of the content, but also the premiumness of the level of like trust. And is that something that you guys actively take to brands, saying this is why you should choose us over, I don't know, random sort of GDN? Or is that something that the clients are asking you? Or are you kind of doing both ways? Or how does that work in terms of like promoting certain publishers are saying, no, but we're a better level of quality because not only are we safe, but we're also reliable. And then that sort of has an effect on what people think about with your brand.
Yeah, I definitely think that for Reuters, trust is one of our biggest selling points. And it's something that we try to bring when we go to clients, because we're not as big, I will say it, as other TV broadcasters or people with print media, because we just don't have the same scale as them. But when you think about Reuters as an entire company, we have these trust principles that is kind of what our journalists, they go out, and whenever we publish anything, it is based on those trust principles. And so really anything on Reuters doesn't have, we are not here to give an opinion. We're here to give the facts, which is something that I think we use as our selling point. And yeah, I think that, we kind of rebranded our site as well. It's now, you have to sign up, but it's not a paid subscription.
Okay.
What it is that you give us data, so we'll know some, I guess, like your interests or what
Right, right.
regions of news you're interested in and data like that, and we're able to use that and pull that back into our advertising.
That's cool. Yeah.
That is really nice. I do think that that's probably the way you said it is a little bit understated, I feel, because I think that this is more my opinion, but than anything else.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and because I do feel like a big part of, again, this is my opinion, personally, not necessarily representing Wahl+Case or anything, but I do feel like a big part of what we're seeing happen now with the tech recession, and like for me, a big marker of this was that like a lot of the platforms that were like really affected were pretty heavily relying on sensationalist media to drive clicks or ad sales, whereas like Apple, who's selling hardware, hasn't really been hit yet. I don't know if that's like down the line things
I
yet.
mean, maybe, but sorry.
Yeah,
Finish your thought first.
Yeah. And so I do think that like a lot of the kind of like the cycle of news that has become necessary to kind of fuel and fund the internet has really been based on divisive things, whereas a company like this, like you were mentioning, Reuters, really priding yourselves on presenting the facts versus like opinions, has a lot of value, I think, and it speaks to maybe what this next hopeful wave of the internet can look like, or what things really should be reliant on versus Facebook's news platform or something like that.
To the point that you were saying, I think that, marketers or advertisers in general are, I think, going to want to think about brand association and brand health and brand equity. And despite the fact that, Twitter has a record number of daily active users at the moment, is that what you want to associate your brand with? Do you want to be, are those the type of people that you want to advertise to? And to be fair, not everyone who's watching and reading Twitter are bad people. I'm on Twitter. But that level of uncertainty of not knowing what's going to come before or after your ad, I think is a bit scary. And so I think you will start to see advertisers turn to more premium sort of placements. The other thing I think that's going to really have a change is obviously what's going on with data, because what's going to happen, I think, is people are going to start questioning more which kind of companies they're going to give their data to. I would argue, like, probably there are a lot of people reevaluating whether or not they want to remain on Twitter. Like, is this a company that I want to know things about me? I think that's going to trickle into other aspects as people get more savvy with data and sort of think about, like, do I want this sort of, unreliable news organization to have information about me? And I think that is going to also affect how advertisers approach things, because the accuracy and the quality of that data is going to be really important. So yeah, I think it's a move in the right direction. And I just think, like, once all of this kind of settles and the dust sort of settles, and because we're still kind of in the throes of COVID, at least in Japan, right? Like, curbs just kind of went away. Like, we just opened the borders in October. So I'm going to be interested to see, like, the level of research that's done, like, once kind of the world has shifted out of COVID, and like what really are some key takeaways that we can make. But for marketers, just don't stop advertising, because people have money, and when they want to spend it, you want them to think of you.
Any last words, any recommendations for marketers from?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that kind of just coming back full circle, it's going to be a lot more selective. I think users are getting more selective about what kinds of news they, take in, what events they participate in, just everything. They're starting to regulate more what kinds of things they're doing. And we actually, for Reuters, our institute, we had a digital news report, which we put out every year. And we are seeing that across the board, just trust in the news is dropping. And there is also just news fatigue, where I think that this report was done around the time where the war between Russia and Ukraine started. And, people just don't, there's just such an overload of information, especially during COVID, when we all were just at home looking at our screens, and people just don't want this much information anymore. You know, they're going to be more selective about what they're reading, what kinds of experiences they're having, what they're watching. So I think that as an advertiser, you really have to take that into account that, you know, maybe you have to set your click goals a little lower. You have to, it might not be the best in the short term, but in the long term, you know, you have to think about your brand health and just making sure that people continue to remember your brand and like what kind of, how do you want to position your brand? Because I think there's an infinite amount of page views and touch points right now on the internet, but you have to really think about if those are valuable and trustworthy and if you really want to position your brand there. So yeah, I think that that's going to be something that it's not an easy task because it's not really easy to, I guess, measure and, you know, it's going to be a process, but I really hope that that's kind of where the industry is headed.
That's great. Yeah, I'll link that digital report in the show notes as well. Yeah, and from my perspective, again, I think just kind of echoing what both of you are saying, where yeah, be brands, marketers, be really cognizant of the overall brand experience, and whether that is in live events or whether that is content, whether that is digital ads, out of home at this point even. And like, I think, yeah, I think it's just be cognizant of the experience you're creating and yeah, again, just brand marketing principles.
And one just quick thing,
Yeah.
I think don't let this deter anyone who wants to work in tech, right? This isn't as bad as I think it is perceived to be. A lot of these people will find jobs. They're very talented people who are coming from the biggest companies in the world. There are startups popping up all over the place, even in Japan. Japan is really pushing that. So I don't think this, like another big takeaway just for, you know, Wahl+Case is I don't think this should deter you from wanting to work in tech. It's going to have its resurgence. I think it's just a tricky year where some, you know, companies take risks, but that's what you're supposed to do. And I think it'll just level off, and I think it's going to just make tech even more exciting, even more competitive. So don't let it deter you working in tech.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melynie, for joining us.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you for having
you.
me.